Okay, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Rasulillahi wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Allahumma ya munawwir ya fattah. نور قلوبنا بنور معرفتك وافتح لنا أبواب حكمتك وانشر علينا خزائن رحمتك إنك على كل شيء قدير. اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وإخلاصا وصدقا في الدين ولا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم وصلى اللهم وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So from this point, Ibn Ashir is going to look at the sunan of the prayer, some ancillary issues like the travel prayers, and then the mandubat or the recommendations in prayers, and then lastly he'll go into the Jum'ah prayer, which then leads us into the section on imama. We'll see how far we can get, inshallah. As we said before, the sunnah in the Mālikī school connotes a confirmed sunnah. It's known as sunnah mu'akkada in some of the other schools. So it's the practice that is not obligatory, but that the Prophet ﷺ was known to never have left. They also have what are known as al-mandubat, which are recommendation. This is a practice that's recommended. And then a fadila, which is a meritorious act. And there's a sort of prioritization that the school has in denoting each of these. And this is especially significant to understand because it has an effect on the rulings for what's known as sajid sahu, or the prostration of forgetfulness. So knowing which act goes into which category of recommendation. Is it a sunnah? Is it a mandub? Or is it a fadila? You'll know if I leave out something or forget something, do I have to make a prostration of forgetfulness as a result of which? Now, also one premise before we sort of dive into this section, it's important to understand that the Malikis differentiate the person praying into three categories. You have the Imam, which is the person who's leading the prayer, the Ma'mum, who's the one who's following the Imam, and then what's known as al-Fadh, who's one that is praying by themselves. So Imam, al-Ma'mum, and al-Fadh. And again, this is important because the rulings will differ pertaining to which one of these you are, or which one of these you find yourself in. So he says, رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين سننها السورة بعد الواقعة مع القيام أولا والثانية. Its sunan are to recite a surah after reciting al-Fatiha. He calls the Fatiha the al-Waqiyah, which is the protector. It's one of the names of the Fatiha. Fatiha is also called al-Hamd. It's also called al-Kitab. It's also called the Shifa, mother of the books or the cure. Yeah. Why is it called the protector? Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. There's just a number of different names that derive out of either entailments of the recitation of the surah or what the surah is known to be in relationship to the religion. So the protector would be one of those things, that it's a means of protection. So then he says a surah after reciting the protector. So the surah then to be recited after Surah Al-Fatiha in the first two rak'ahs of a prayer is a sunnah. And then he says standing for those recitations, i.e. the recitation of a surah and the standing for it, are separate acts. Those are separate sunan. Similar to the Fatiha and the standing for the Fatiha when we talked about the obligations of prayer were two separate obligations. Or the takbirat al-ihram and standing for the takbirat al-ihram. Those are two separate things, right, in terms of the obligation. Because one is qawliya and one is fi'liya. One is something that is said, it's speech, and the other one is an action, which they differentiate between in the madhhab. And then he says certain prayers are to be recited audibly, and others are to be recited silently. Jahrun wa sirrun بمحل لهما تكبيره إلا الذي تقدم. Reciting both audibly and silently in their respective places for each of the two. So the subh prayer, which customarily we call the fajr prayer, is audible. The maghrib prayer is audible in the first two rak'ahs, and the isha is audible in the first two rak'ahs as well. And then the dhuhr and the asr prayer are silent prayers. Yeah. No embarrassing questions.
If you're praying alone, do you have to be audible, or can you? Because I never do fajr.
Yeah, so that's a good question. There's a difference depending on which category of prayer you are, like we said before. So the Imam, the Ma'moom, and the Musalli al-Fadh. So the one who's doing it by themselves has a different ruling. The Imam recites aloud, we know that. The one who's being led by the Imam, the sunnah is to listen to the recitation of the Imam. So they're not required to recite their own Fatiha or a surah after the Fatiha afterwards. They just listen to the Imam in the prayers that he recites audibly. What is the definition of audibly and silent? There's typically a delineation of minimum and maximum amount. So the minimum amount for audibly is that the Imam can hear himself. So in an audible prayer, one that is recited out loud, the minimum is that the Imam can hear himself. And the maximum, they say there is no maximum. So loudspeakers covering any distance, for example, is permissible. For the silent prayer, the minimum is that one is moving their tongue. Like you can't just recite in your head. You have to say the words with your tongue if you can, if you're able to. And then the maximum for a silent prayer is that the person who's praying can hear him or herself. And this applies to women as well.
Sorry, can you kind of repeat that, the last part?
So the maximum for a silent prayer, for the one who's praying alone, is that they can hear themselves.
That's a lot.
Yeah, so, say for example, I'm praying dhuhr, okay? And, I'm saying, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Mālikī Yawmiddin, Iyyāka na'budu wa iyyāka nastaʿīn, ihdinas sirātal mustaqīm. I can hear myself. You guys can kind of hear me. That's the maximum that I can do.
The bare minimum of hearing yourself.
Exactly. If I started going, Alhamdulillahi, no, that's audible. Now I've done something that's outside of the scope of what that prayer allows. Okay? And then he says, تَكْبِيرُهُ إِلَّا الَّذِي تَقَدَّمَ. Saying Allahu Akbar in each of the transitions of the prayer, i.e. not including the opening takbirat al-ihram. So from qiyam to ruku', like going into the bowing position, you would say Allahu Akbar. And then down to sujood, you would say Allahu Akbar. And then into the sitting position, Allahu Akbar, etc. Now there's a difference of opinion on whether each individual one of those is considered a sunnah, or the sum of all of them together is the sunnah. And again, this has implications on the the prostration of forgetfulness. So then he says, كل تشهد جلوس أول والثاني لام للسلام يحصل. Each tashahhud and each sitting, both the first and second, are separate sunan, except the amount of time in the final sitting to say salam, which is an obligation. So he says the sitting for the tashahhud and the tashahhud, again, are two different things. So the Malikis, the actual sigha of the tashahhud is tahiyatu lillah, zakiyatu lillah, tayyibatu salawatu lillah, السلام عليك أيها النبي ورحمة الله وبركاته السلام علينا وعلى عباد الله الصالحين أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله So that would be, and we'll go over it again, but that's the sigha, okay? Saying that is one of the sunan, and then actually sitting for that is another one of the sunan.
Sorry, what do you mean by sitting? What is somebody gonna do not sit?
Yeah,
Oh, really?
potentially somebody could.
So what do you mean by that? Like, say I didn't sit, like, say I'm not doing sunnah, like, how does that work exactly?
Yeah. You can find very interesting components that, maybe someone is in a situation where they're not able to. I don't know, I can give you I saw an individual once praying, standing up in a line in Egypt because he had to finish this is not a joke actually, they had to finish one of their national ID cards, and anybody who knows that process knows that that's like a year-long thing, and you could be standing in line for a year. So, could you do it? I saw him doing it. It was pretty interesting. But but what they're really doing is they're simply just trying to say that when it comes to, say for example, here's a more of a real life scenario. You didn't sit you forgot to sit in the middle tashahhud. Okay, so you went from your sujood and then you went straight up to the third rak'ah. In other words, you forgot to sit. What happens now? Well, you can only know what happens now if you know, what are those positions, what did I miss, and what exactly is it categorized as? Does that make sense?
So theoretically, in the Mālikī madhhab, if that were to happen, then before starting Fatiha, you could do tashahhud standing and then
No.
Fatiha.
No. So in that scenario, you would just continue.
Okay, you just continue.
Yeah, you would just continue, and then you would make such a sahu. Okay, but you would know that you can distinguish, for example, between that and I didn't say Allahu Akbar coming into the prayer. Am I good? No, you're not. You haven't entered the prayer. Can I make sajda sahu for that? No, you can't make sajda sahu for something like that. You haven't actually entered the prayer yet, right? And that's the difference between somebody knowing what actions are obligatory, what actions are sunan, and then the removal of a sunnah, for example, as we'll come to see, that is going to mean that one has to make sajda sahu. There are going to be other sunan, as we'll come to see, that they are sunan, but they take the ruling of a mandub or a recommendation. So even if you don't do it out of forgetfulness, you wouldn't necessarily have to make a prostration of forgetfulness now. So that's what they're doing, is they're delineating what all of these actions are in the categories that they belong to, so that you know, if I miss one, what do I have to do to make it up, and how do I make sure that I can fulfill the prayer properly? So in all of the prayers, except for the subh prayer, you sit and recite the tashahhud twice. So if we're saying that the tashahhud, the actual recitation of the tashahhud and the sitting for the tashahhud are two different things, then ostensibly the total number of sunan for this position is actually 4. Right? Because you're doing it twice. Sitting and making tashahhud twice in the prayers that would require it. But then he says, except for the sitting of the final salam, which, as we said last time, is obligatory. So the obligation in terms of the sitting is the amount of time that one sits to say assalamu alaikum. And part of the reasoning is that any movement, any fa'liyya that accompanies an obligatory qawliyya, any obligatory speech, itself becomes then obligatory. وَسَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ فِي الرَّفْعِ مِنْ رُكُوعِهِ أَوْرَدَ. سَمِعَ اللَّهُ لِمَنْ حَمِدَ, while rising, bowing, should be said. And this is, as he says, الفذ والإمام هذا أكد والباقي كالمندوب في الحكم بدا. By the one praying alone and by the imam leading others, these are all confirmed sunan, and the remaining sunan are like recommended acts in their ruling. So this is what I was talking to you about. So everything that we've taken thus far, okay, ending with saying Sami Allahu liman hamida, Allah hears the one who praises him, while rising from the bowing by the imam and the one praying by him or herself, is a sunnah. And so it's not a sunnah for the one who's being led, but the ma'moom, the one who's being led, would respond to the imam saying, Allahumma rabbana wa lakal hamd. This is going to come later, I don't want to confuse you guys. So from this point forward now, everything that we're going to be saying is a sunnah. It's considered a sunnah in the madhhab. And if one were to omit it forgetfully, you would not necessarily have to do a prostration of forgetfulness. Versus everything that we've taken already, which is a sunnah, okay, where if you did omit it forgetfully, you would have to do a prostration of forgetfulness. You don't have to worry about trying to get all of this down right now. I'm just giving you kind of a, just let it shower over you. Don't worry, I'm not being quizzed here yet. But it's a lot easier than I'm making it, I'll tell you that. Okay, so then Ibn Ashir says, إقامة سجوده على اليدين وطرف الرجلين مثل الركبتين. So from the sunan are the iqama, so actually making the iqama before you begin the prayer. And the iqama is typically seen as the call to prayer that is done immediately before the prayer begins. So this is a sunnah for a group prayer or for the fadh, the person praying alone. And it's both for men and women. And the sigha in the Mālikī school is a little bit different than what you've heard before. It's Allahu Akbar, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah, Hayya ala salah, Hayya ala al-falah, Qad iqamatis salah, Allahu Akbar, La ilaha illallah. The Hanafis, right, there's a lot more salah and falah. And, we're one and out, okay? So sometimes, you know, that might take people for surprise. Just wait until we get to the adhan. Alhamdulillah. And then he says, prostrating with both hands and the tips of both feet touching the ground, like the touching of both of the knees. So ideally, right, your prostration is going to also include your palms, tips of your feet. And the tips of your feet, this is if you can do it, they're actually bent down, okay, pointing towards the qibla. The knees are also on the floor. The forehead, the bridge of the nose, okay, are also included in that.
And these are just mandub, so if...
Correct.
So
There's sunan with the ruling of a mandub, yeah.
So if they're not touching and such that it's
Still valid,
still valid.
yeah.
Is that the same across madhhab or mine?
I don't know. Maybe not.
'Cause, yeah,
I mean, you should tell me,
was
I
that
don't know.
If they're not touching, then the sajda doesn't count, but I might have understood that wrong. Right?
Mm.
That's what I was trying to clarify.
Yeah, it could be different. I mean, I assume it probably is. Yeah.
Sorry, 'cause I'm just like trying to like visualize all of this.
Sure.
There are people who do like you could do sujood without your hands touching the floor. I'm so confused about what you're saying. Is that a thing?
Well, so again, it's not necessarily saying like, try this out.
Oh yeah.
What it's saying is that if for some reason this was forgotten, after something happened that, led one to not actually be capable of doing it, you would know, well, it's a sunnah with the ruling of a mandub, so it's not like the prayer is invalid or something because of it.
So like if you're carrying a child while praying.
Good. Yeah. And it's good that you're asking this question too, because somebody could be confused to think, well, so these are the things that you're saying like I can omit? No. This is a fiqh class. We're talking about legalities here. So what we are trying to more or less encapsulate in terms of our understanding is the way that a jurist is thinking about the legal praxis of the religion. Typically, and this is across the board, any juridical counsel is looking at sort of least common denominator across the board. Like, what are the minimum requirements for something to be valid? So this isn't necessarily the ideal way to do this. The Sahaba are not sitting around differentiating between like what they're going to. They didn't ask the Prophet like, is this an obligatory or is it a recommendation? And they did the whole thing, right? That's what we're supposed to be doing. But in a fiqh class, what we're trying to understand is, well, where do these actually sit so that I know in certain situations whether or not my prayer would have been valid or not valid, or how do I make it up? And this also is, extremely important when dealing with communal issues, as you'll come to see. Especially if you're leading a community or you're trying to help out in certain situations. One of the things that I found in our communities, for example, is like you're at IOK, for example. It's a good example because IOK has a lot of people there that are very learned. Now, you may have a few people who know some of the rulings in terms of prayer. You typically would want those people to be at the front of the prayer line. Why? Because say the Imam loses his wudu or gets a bloody nose or something like that and has to leave. Now, if you have people who have done this work, they'll know what to do in that situation and how to carry it along and how to make sure that everyone, moves in the right direction based on their knowledge. If they don't, you're going to have a lot of chaos. People are not going to know what to do, and from that point forward, people are probably going to leave the prayer. Things are going to be done wrong, so on and so forth. So, in essence, this is helping our community in terms of their literacy of the religion, performing these communal obligations and being able to do so in a way that is right and proper to the actual legality itself. And then also you'll come to see that you may have actually been a lot more strict on yourself when it comes to these types of things than the fiqh is itself. So like, so even if I miss that, I don't actually have to make up the entire prayer. Like, I've been my whole life making up the entire prayer, and I didn't know that it wasn't an obligation on me. Well, so there you go. So those are other reasons, obviously. And there are plenty more, but that's more or less the way that we should be trying to frame this discussion in our minds, inshallah. Good question. إنصات مقتد بجهر ثم رد على الإمام واليسار وأحد. As our attentive silence for the one following the Imam during an audible prayer. So he says basically that attentive silence for the ma'mum is also a sunnah, i.e. it's not recommended for the one being led to recite themselves in these audible prayers. However, when being led in silent prayers or in the rak'ahs that are done silently, it's recommended for the one who's being led in the prayer to recite the Fatiha or the Fatiha and a short surah, depending on what rak'ah you're in, obviously. But if you didn't do it, it's fine. All right? Well, the Malikis were. Aren't you glad you picked the Maliki madhhab? That's what I say. making my pitch. Okay. Okay, and then he says at the conclusion of the prayer, the person may make a salam to the Imam in his direction. And if there's someone to the left, they can also say salam to them. So the Mālikī madhhab, the first salam is the obligatory salam, and it's just assalamu alaikum. But then if you're doing the full thing, there would actually be three, potentially could be three, where it's assalamu alaikum to the Imam, assalamu alaikum to the person that's on your left.
Oh, it's not the angel?
No, it's to the yeah.
Oh, that's weird.
I don't know if that's actually an opinion in another madhhab though. I mean, these things also have merit. Sometimes you'll find that there's...
When you're praying alone.
Yeah. So you can still do it like that too. I wouldn't dispel that idea just yet. Yeah. But as far as the Mālikī madhhab is concerned, it's to the Imam and to the person to the left of you. If there isn't a person to the left of you, you wouldn't do the left salam. In the,
So if you're praying alone, do you not say salam?
you just do one. You can do two, that's fine, but the
Yeah.
one salam, assalamu alaikum in the Mālikī madhhab, that's all they do.
And who are you saying salam alaikum to at that point?
That's how you exit the prayer. So yeah, that's the way that you exit the prayer.
Oh, okay.
So the first one is to exit the prayer. The second one is to the Imam. The third one is to the person to the left of you. If there is a person to the left of you.
Got it.
I mean, technically the obligatory salam takes one out of the prayer. So, but the second two can still be done and would be recommended given these circumstances. All right. Any questions? Need to get a better mic. Alaikum salam. Yeah, go ahead.
Just to clarify, if you're alone, saying one salam is what's recommended. Or it's obligatory to at least say one salam, and it's recommended to say one. But if you are in a condition where you're being led by an imam, then you can say two, or is recommended to say two. If there is one more person with you, and that person is to your left or more, then it's recommended to say the three salam. Is that a good understanding?
One salam is obligatory. You have to say it to exit the prayer. The second and third salam that we just talked about are sunnahs with the ruling of a mandub. In other words, it's seen as a recommendation.
What about for the imam?
So the imam would just say one. Again, it's obligatory. He could say two. In other words, saying it to, those who are to the left of him.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm just, sometimes I feel like it's, I don't know if I feel. I should just clarify that. So, the fadila or the mandub of adding the additional salams is always rewardful, right? It's always a good thing to do in addition to. Is there any condition where, outside of praying alone, that we're just saying one will be better? Or is it always just an extra reward to include the others?
No, the recommendations for the two additional are the conditions that, number one, you're saying it to the imam, and the third one is that you're saying it to the person on the left of you. If there is no imam and there is no person to the left of you, then it's not recommended that you do those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I get it. Shukran.
Afwan.
So if I'm praying alone and like saying I'm going to that is not saying? I mean, is that, I don't get it. Like, you're saying,
So you can say a second salam, the way that most of the Sunni world says Assalamu alaikum, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and that's meritorious. It's fine. But generally speaking, in the madhhab, when you're praying alone, really the way to do it is simply just Assalamu alaikum. One, and you're out. Well, that's the custom that they trace back to the Prophet ﷺ from the Mālikī school. In other words,
that's the most accurate one, isn't it?
as far as Malikis are concerned, yes. Yes. I mean, they would argue that this is the one. But the other madhabs would disagree, right? I mean,
So when you say, do you just do salam one?
I do, but it depends on where I am. So if I won't say where. If I'm at a certain place leading the prayer, and I know that they're like very adamant about 2 salams, then I'm going to do that. And it makes a difference, by the way. So like, for example, there's an opinion, I think there's an opinion, pretty sure, in the Hanbali madhab that it's actually 2 salams that are obligatory. So while it may be the obligation for the Malikis is 1, the Hanafis is 1 too. Like the Hanafis say, the Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, that's it. You're actually out of the prayer. The second one is just a recommendation. But for the Hanbalis, I'm pretty sure that the 2 are what are obligatory. Which is the reason why they say wait until the 2 have been done and then do your salams, because if the person who's leading the prayer, for example, is a Hanbali, and he intends to pray with that position, given that that position is the accurate position, it could be off. So he says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Now he's out. The intention is that after that second one, he's out. Well, he says, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and then I go, Assalamu alaikum. Well, I'm out with that first one, and he still isn't out, which means that I'm now out of the prayer before the Imam's out of the prayer. Batalat salah. That salah actually is invalid. So that's why you should wait. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Actually, one of my favorite ones.
Yeah. Don't do that. You'll be fine. This is all simply just trying to sort of take where you're at and build upon that. على الإمام واليسار وأحد به وزائد سكون للحضور سترة غير مقتد خاف المرور. So then he says, was there also added stillness after one's initial obligatory composure at any stopping place to maintain presence of the heart? Did I lose the people on... Assalamu alaikum. Assalamu alaikum. The internet connection died here and I logged back in through my phone, so inshallah you all can hear me now.
Yes.
Okay.
Alaikum assalam.
Okay, so we stopped at this point where he says that the moment of stillness beyond the one obligatory moment that we discussed in the obligations of salah would be recommended. So as we said before, there is an obligation upon us in each of the positions to have a moment of tuma'nina, stillness. So you go into ruku', you wait for a moment where there's a stillness, and then you come up and you wait, stillness. So that's obligatory. Anything beyond that moment would be seen as just a recommendation. And then he says a prayer barrier for either the Imam or someone praying by themselves, especially when there's traffic. So the prayer barrier, right, we've seen these before. You should also beware of just being a jerk, because people that like go into places where like everybody's moving around and they like assume like, hey, I'm going to pray right here. You see this oftentimes in like the holy places, and it's really weird. But we should avoid that, obviously, for ourselves. But in the school, the barrier itself has to have some irtifa' to it, has to have some height, like a stick or a bag or just anything that has some height to it.
Two questions.
Yeah.
First, this word muqtadin, is this a synonym for ma'moom? So could you also refer to the ma'moom as muqtad?
Yeah.
Okay. And then, is there a concept of like a natural sutra for the Malikis? Like this kind of a, I guess, a distance where it's like that's kind of a natural range of where you should like give someone space for salah and like not pass through. If they haven't placed a physical sutra.
If they haven't placed a physical sutra,
Yeah.
so if they're in a prayer hall or something like that, then I'm not sure if the madhhab has a stipulation as to like what would be outside of that range or not. But generally, for any congregation that's praying, that actually is deferred to the Imam himself. So, if you're, having to move for whatever reason during the prayer, which is not necessarily the best thing to do, but you shouldn't, be, that's not a problematic issue. Obviously, if you have to move around and there's no other way to pass, that's fine as well. This is really just talking about, someone who is sort of, as you know, adamantly kind of passing between people, where we recognize that they're in a state of inviolability, so you can't just go up to someone and accost them in this way.
So like what's the kind of minimum distance that you should give someone, like if they're praying on their own, or
So-
if it's the Imam?
Yeah, so long as you're kind of out of their vantage point, I think you're fine. So then he says, جهر السلام كلم تشهدي وأن يصلي على محمد, vocalizing the first salam, saying the tashahhud in full, and that one supplicate for our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So to say the obligatory salam out loud is recommended. The being out loud or audibly with the salam is the recommendation. You have to say it, but to vocalize it is a sunnah. And then saying the tashahhud in full, the one that we mentioned, is also another one. And then to say the Salat al-Ibrahimiyya, which is considered a separate part, right? So when you get into, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin wa ala ali Muhammad kama sallaita ala Ibrahim wa ala ali Ibrahim, that's separate from the first tashahhud part, right? Tahiyyatu lillah, zakiyatu lillah, salawatu tayyibatu lillah. So they split the two. I think we just lost these people again. Oh, no, we didn't. You all are here and can see me and can hear me. Check. Sidi Majid, if you can let me know if you're here. Oh, thank you, Hanan.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay, it moved again, so I wasn't sure what happened. So these are the mandubat in the first and the second julus.
And the saying the salam out loud,
Yeah.
That's the same case for all three types of musalli, whether it's
Yeah.
prayer out loud or silent.
Yeah, good question. So then he says, سُنَّ الْأَذَانُ لِجَمَاعَةٍ أَتَتْ فرضا بوقته وغير انطلبت. The call to prayer, the adhan, is a sunnah for a group that has come to an obligatory prayer in its appropriate time and intends by it to call others. So the adhan, which is a call to prayer, is a sunnah and recommended when an obligatory prayer has come in and in where a group who intend to pray that obligatory prayer want to try to call others to that prayer. So obviously, as an institutionalized process, this is to be done at every masjid. So this would also mean that a closed group, for whatever reason, who aren't necessarily calling others to come pray with them, is not recommended to give the adhan. They can, but it's just not considered a sunnah.
So if you're by yourself or if you're with...
Yeah, so basically an individual by themselves wouldn't call the adhan. Yeah. And no adhan for other than obligatory prayers either. So like the Eid prayer doesn't have an adhan, the Sunan prayers don't have adhan, etc. Now giving the adhan is also just a good thing. I mean, there's merit in it for other reasons. For purifying a place, we know that giving an adhan is good for that. We know that shaitan flees from the sound of the adhan, for example. And I do it typically in my home, so my children can hear it. I mean, we were kind of in the situation that we were just in with the lockdown, things changed, right? So I think that also, inshallah, people were doing more adhans in their homes. But we want to try to make it normative on that level. But generally speaking, in the Mālikī madhhab, you're only doing it for the obligatory prayers. Okay. Now the Mālikī adhan, as I said before, is a little bit different. It goes like this: Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, and then soft voice. أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة, and you can do the حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله. So you can see how I started off with 2 takbirat, not 4, and then I said the tashahud, right? أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله أشهد أن محمد رسول الله, and then I went and repeated it again, but this time in a louder voice. There are other siyagh, for example, there are different ways that this is also recited, things that are said that are merited. We don't have to go through all of it, but just know that sometimes you'll hear other things, and these things are fine for the most part. The Shi'i call, there's, Ali Waliullah and these kinds of things that are said, that's outside of the scope of normative Sunni practice. There are merits to substantiating some of the aqwal, for example, though, that come from them that aren't normative in what we see in the Sunni world, though. And there are hadith that's substantiated. So, So now Ibn Ashir includes a couple lines about traveling prayer in this section because the Salat al-Musafir is considered a sunnah in the Maliki school. And obviously this concept of shortening the prayers is something that the Quran itself has revealed. وَإِذَا ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَلَيْسَ عَلَيْكُمْ جُنَاحٌ أَن تَقْصُرُوا مِنَ الصَّلَاةِ. So if you ضَرَبْتُمْ فِي الْأَرْضِ, ay, you travel in the world, there's no harm, one can say, in shortening the prayers. So even though there's a shortening of the prayer and the other schools would consider this to be a rukhsa or a dispensation, Ashab al-Malikiyya consider it to be a sunnah. So it's preferable to shorten the prayer if you've met the conditions of traveling rather than praying the full prayer. So he says, وَقَصْرُ مَنْ سَافَرَ أَرْبَعَ بُرُدْ ظُهْرًا عِشًا عَصْرًا إِلَى حِينَ يَعُودْ. Also shortening Dhuhr, Isha and Asr prayers for whoever travels 4 burud or more until the time he returns to his place of residence. So one shortens Dhuhr, Asr and Isha, i.e. you only pray 2 rak'ahs for these prayers rather than 4. For whoever travels more than 4 burud, which is a unit of measurement that we'll talk about. The barid was, during the early period, the messengers that were sent to neighboring lands to deliver messages were known as the barid. And they tried to do this as fast as humanly possible for their time. And what they would do is typically ride on horseback from city to city, exchanging horses and exchanging riders once they got into these new locations. So they wouldn't wear themselves out, wouldn't wear the animal out. And it allowed for a reasonably fast method of delivering things. So once the person got to that station, they then would give, whatever deliverable to the next individual with the new horse, and then they would go. So this distance between one location and the point where they would swap horses and messengers sometimes was seen as one length of distance. So 4 of those distances, 4 burud, okay, is then what is being referred to or referenced in this concept. There are narrations of Ibn Umar as well as Ibn Abbas, for example, who state that we should shorten our prayers when traveling for burud. Now the scholars can agree on that. They disagreed as to necessarily how much that would be. But generally speaking, this measurement, okay, these 4 burud, convert to another measurement known as a farsakh, which some said would constitute 16 to make 4 burud. So you have 16 farasikh. And each farsakh is around 3 miles, or roughly 5 kilometers. And every mile they substantiated as 4,000 dhira'a, okay, which is from the elbow to the top of the middle finger, that distance, or roughly 3,000 feet. Now this calculates to 48 Arabian miles. Yeah.
If you travel that distance on a daily basis, though, are you still considered?
Yeah, so there's a difference of opinion. I mean, the point here is that it's not something that you're doing within sort of the confines of your own municipality. Like I could be saying, like, I'm a sheep herder or something like that. I'd do like 30 miles a day, but I do them in my city or something, or, neighboring cities. That necessarily wouldn't be considered one who's traveling.
In our times, living in California especially, we have to travel from
Yes.
commute typically from one city to another. So if you're doing that on a daily basis,
Yes.
you can still consider yourself.
You can still consider yourself musafir, yes. Irregardless of the mode of transportation. So, plane, trains, and automobiles.
Cheating.
I know, that's what some people, there's a reason why. I mean, we don't have to get into it now because there's just a lot to get through, but it's not, as they say, simply just madhinnat al-mashaqqa, like the understanding of like hardship, but also in recognizing that there's going to be a particular distance or a quantitative measurement involved in regulating it for everyone, irregardless of like where they're at. Now the scholars obviously say that this travel, so first of all, the destination has to be in mind. Okay, it's not like I got up one night and I was like cruising, realized that I traveled 40 miles or something like that. I'm like, okay, do a traveler prayer. You're conscious of it before you go. You have a destination in mind. The destination or the intention for the actual traveling itself cannot be for impermissible means or pursuits. Like you're not like going to party at a club and then you're going to pray the traveler prayer before you go. Or like you're headed to Vegas to gamble, and like on the way you're gonna stop and do traveler prayer. It's not how it works.
So obviously cut off situation, but in that case, it would be helpful to not do it.
Yeah, like if you were to do that, your prayer would be accepted if you did pray. In other words, if you went to Vegas to go gamble and you legitimately prayed the, traveler prayer while you were there, your prayer is not accepted.
So what do you mean by like you have to have a destination? Like sometimes I like drive for like go like 100 miles. Like I couldn't do that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be necessarily.
What if your destination is like?
I mean, if you don't know going into it, you're just kind of like roaming and you end up traveling. And you could make the intention at that point, like, okay, I'm traveling. But no, generally speaking, like there's much more intentionality that has to be had prior to this than someone who just like got up and just started like roaming around and ended up going past that distance. So then he says, مما وراء السكنى إليه إن قدم مقيم أربعة أيام يتم. As long as he passed the dwellings of his town, he should desist from shortening them when he reaches them upon his return. So the question is, as he says, as long as he passed the dwellings, i.e., when do you start to pray as a traveler? And I think that this was the question that Nasreen had. So for example, Dhuhr is in and I'm going to the airport and my flight leaves around like Maghrib or something like that. And so I decide, well, I'll just pray Dhuhr and Asr, shortened at home, because when I get to the airport, who knows what's going to happen, and I just want to get this done. That's impermissible in the madhhab, because you haven't begun to travel yet. Travel doesn't begin by intention, it begins by actual movement. All right, so this is a common misconception. I don't know if there's a madhhab that does allow it. I want to say the Hanafis do, but I don't know. Do you know?
I don't think my question was clear.
Yeah, sure.
Can you?
Yeah, I can hear
My
you.
question is, for example, like if for example, I live in Anaheim and my work is 37 miles away. I work in San Juan Capistrano, and if I'm driving on the 5 freeway, there's still land, there's still buildings. Does it count only by the distance, or do you start the travel when you see less houses and land in more desert area? Or let me
سؤالها انه العد
Yeah, yeah.
مناطق العمران ام لا.
Right. So this question, generally in the traditional texts, they would say that you begin your actual journey, i.e., you've entered into the state of travel once you have exited the confines of the city or the town that you're from, because there would be a series of houses in your town, and then once you have exited the town, you're kind of in the middle of nowhere until you reach the next town. And so they say once you cross that point is when you now are considered to be in a state of travel, and you can begin to shorten your prayers in the madhhab. Now obviously that doesn't exist per se in the way that we operate today. And so what the fatwa is then in relationship to this is that once a person leaves one's own municipality, even if the towns are connected, so once you're out of your municipality, you're considered to be musafir at that point, given that you're going to be going to a destination that's farther than 27.7 miles. So like you live in Irvine and you're headed to, I don't know, San Diego. Okay, so, once you exit Irvine and you get into like, what's the city? No, it's the other way, right? Going to San Diego. I don't know, south. Yeah, but you're in Irvine and you're headed to San Francisco. Okay. Once you hit Anaheim, خلاص, you're outside of the municipality, or once you even before that. Does that make sense? Does that answer the question, Nisreen?
Oh no. Oh yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay.
It's the same for the
So-
Ahnaf.
To clarify, Sheikh, if I may
Yeah,
ask, does
I think
the
so.
mileage or the distance start to count from the moment then you leave your home, or do you start counting it at that boundary? So that, okay, I'm in Irvine, I left Irvine, I'm in Anaheim. From that point, I start counting.
No, you start counting it from the point of where you are, your home. But
Okay,
you
got it.
wouldn't be in a state of travel until you're outside of your municipality. So
Okay.
like you leave your home headed towards wherever as a traveler. And you know, you're with me, so we're in Corona together. But you haven't gotten out of Corona, and when you like stop at a gas station and you're like, you know what, I'm going to pray traveler prayer right now here at this gas station. No, it's not permissible. You need to leave Corona first. Does that make sense?
That makes sense.
Okay.
شيخ هذه يعني فتوى جديدة ضمن المذهب أو يعني من زمان يعملون بهذا this way.
No, this is the consideration of the madhhab from the foundation. I mean, when it says that مما وراء السكن إليه إن قدم, that means that one has passed the dwelling of the town. Now, in our time, since people who live in major cities could travel the entire distance required and still be in the same city, the fatwa given on this issue was that once a person leaves one's own municipality, even if the towns are interconnected. So like on the East Coast, for example, if you're in Brooklyn and you're leaving Brooklyn to go to Maine, once you leave Brooklyn, even though you're still in New York, you're no longer within that municipality. You would be considered in a state of travel. So it's a fatwa that is given on the basis of understanding how our towns work relative to the original understanding of the text. I mean, we don't live in the same type of towns that they had in the classical period anymore.
Got it. And the municipality, like you just take it as the name, for example, you consider yourself out from Irvine just by entering Tustin, or just like have a specific district?
Yes, yes.
Barakallahu feek.
وإياكم. Okay. So then he says, once you return back to your town, you have to go back to praying normally.
So as soon as you enter the city boundaries again.
Exactly. And the last condition, anyone who intends to be visiting a place for 4 days has to pray normally as a resident of the area once they arrive at that area. So say, for example, we're traveling to New York from LA and planning to spend 2 weeks in New York. While we're traveling, we can shorten, like the actual traveling process itself, we can shorten. But once we arrive there, since our stay is going to be at least 4 complete days, i.e. 20 prayers, we have to pray the regular way once we arrive in New York. In other words, you would have to pray the full 4 rak'ahs for these prayers. Well, what if I don't know how long I'm going to stay? And, you know, I'm just going there and just kind of like taking it day by day. We'll see how it goes. If you think it's going to be at least 4 days, then you would have to pray as a muqīm, as a resident of the area. Otherwise, you know, if you're saying like I could be here for 1 day, I could be here for 2 days, you don't really know. Technically, you can continue shortening until the day that you leave. And then lastly, he doesn't mention it, but it's a common question, the combining of prayers. So jama' is different than qasr, right? Qasr is the shortening of prayers, jama' is the combining of prayers. Combining of prayers is not something that the Malikis do unless one is actually in the act of traveling. So for example, we're taking a road trip to the Bay Area again. and we're staying there for 3 days. Actually, we're taking our road trip to Big Bear to go to the retreat. Okay, and we're staying there for 3 days. On our way there, i.e. while we're traveling to our destination, to Big Bear, we can both shorten the prayer and combine the prayers. So Dhuhr and Asr can be prayed together in either of the 2 times, and Maghrib and Isha can be prayed together in either of those 2 times, and then we would shorten the ones that he discusses, Dhuhr, Asr, and Isha. But once we arrive at Big Bear, since we're staying for 3 days, less than 4, we would continue to shorten the prayers, but we wouldn't be allowed to combine the prayers anymore once we got there. So you would still have to pray each prayer in the time. You wouldn't combine Dhuhr and Asr or Maghrib and Isha together anymore. You would just simply pray Dhuhr as 2 in the time of Dhuhr, Asr as 2 once Asr comes in, so on and so forth. All right?
And this combining is a rukhsa?
And this combining, I don't know if they would consider it a rukhsa or not. Maybe. I assume. Yes. It's a good question. I'll look it up. Yep.
Interesting.
I know.
Kind of weird, right? I can't say that.
No, it's not. I mean, it's just, again, the frame of mind that I think sometimes we come at it through is a little bit different than what was actually thought of. Now, there are different opinions on this matter, but, we're talking about the Mālikī madhhab here, so. Okay, so we're at 8:22. We do need to stop, but I do want to try and... Maghrib came in, huh?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, well, since Maghrib came in, we do have to stop then, inshaAllah. And we'll try and get through this next section, which is the recommendations, the mandubat. So before we begin that section, then we'll stop here. Any final questions or comments?